Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Soul Protocol, your headquarters for the inner revolution. I'm Lea Evigt, your host this week and every week. And gosh, this week, I hope you're holding on to your britches because things are going to get personal. I figured it was probably time to tell the Lea Evigt origin story, which is a story that I've never told publicly before. A few people in my life know the whole story, but even among my close friends, there are some who haven't heard all of the details. So I'll share all of that today, as well as a little bit of how I was raised and where my philosophies come from, just kind of to give context to what this is all about. But then I'm also going to share a 4-step creative process because you may like to, at the end of this podcast, go off and reinvent some part of yourself. And I'm going to give you the tools to do that. All right, so here we go. I have to say that this particular podcast feels very intimidating. I think I can talk all about the inner revolution and change maker architecture and all of the inner work that a person could hypothetically do without getting too squeamish about it. But when it comes to me talking about my own life, it's a little bit trickier. So be gentle with me as I move through this. I'm going to try to be gentle with myself. So Lea Evigt is not my legal name. And a surprise bonus, pink is not my natural hair color. So I am kind of coming out into the world for the first time, actually just recently, putting my stuff on social media and online on my website and with the creation of this podcast. And to my community of friends, this feels extremely sudden. But it's actually not that sudden. It's been in the works for about 2 years now. And I started to kind of reevaluate my presentation. I wanted to reevaluate certain aspects of my persona because I had gone through this extremely difficult time in my life. And I sincerely felt coming out of it like I was an entirely different person than I was going into it. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So let's go back to the beginning. I'll tell you a little bit about my childhood. I was raised in Colorado, and I was raised in a very conservative, very Christian community, and then also raised between 2 different households. So I had kind of a unique upbringing in that way. My dad lived about an hour and a half away from my mom, so I got to see him on the weekends, and I spent the rest of the time with my mom and my stepdad. And these 2 experiences, first living in this community where there was a pretty narrow range of opinions and a pretty narrow range of belief systems, life perspectives, etc. But then also living in a family situation that, where we had 2 different houses and I would go back and forth between them. And it was a very civil, friendly, peaceful arrangement. All of that brought different elements into making me who I am today. So the Christian part really has become the foundation of everything that I bring to this podcast. I grew up learning about the fruits of the Spirit: kindness, goodness, self-control. What is it? Patience. Oh, they're going to come to me later. But this very foundational Christian understanding of what it means to be compassionate, what it means to forgive, what does it mean to be a good Samaritan. All of these lessons were so foundational in my upbringing. And as I got older, I expanded that perspective into Buddhism, Taoism. I'm trying to learn more about all of the major religions of the world, but also some of the more obscure ones, some of the New Age spiritual stuff. I actually am someone who believes that all paths lead to the summit. And this Christian upbringing that I had was just the launching point for that. So, let's see, academics were a very important part of my upbringing, which is maybe why I'm so curious and studious now. Still, I would say that I'm kind of a bookworm. But I I was really taught that I had to be diligent and that being very diligent with my academics was going to be the road to success. And in a lot of ways, that was true. I went to a solid high school and I got good grades. Then I went to a solid college and I got pretty good grades. And I studied very practical things, finance, and legal studies. I did get an art minor because my soul needed it. And I spent a semester in Italy studying art. So that was really fun and interesting and expansive. But my senior year of college, after I'd been on this very straight and narrow path for the entirety of my so far growing up, I met my husband, or the man who was going to become my husband, who then would become my husband because he was my husband and he's no longer my husband. All right, see if you can clock that. We met when I was 21 years old. We got married when I was 25. I had my son when I was 26 and my daughter at 28. And by and large, I had a really great marriage and a really great family life. I actually loved the life that we were building. And then COVID hit. And like so many marriages, my marriage was really heavily impacted by the shelter in place rule, but also just by a lot of the anxiety that was swirling in our community. And we decided in the middle of COVID that we were going to go ahead and move to Finland, which is his country of origin. And it was an adventure we'd always wanted to have anyway, so it felt like as good a time as any to move out there. And I think that even in retrospect, it was the right move to make, but it did bring a lot of new layers of challenges. So I was in Helsinki, and during COVID, Finnish people who are already kind of notorious for being socially just a little bit more, is shy the right word? Or they have all kinds of words they'll use to describe themselves, but maybe I'll leave that up to them. The point was that I went from a culture in Colorado where everybody's got a million friends and you can call anybody on any given day to hang out, to a culture where everybody has very closely established groups of friends that they've had for years and years, and it's almost impossible to get into those. So I did meet some really wonderful women at the Finnish course that I was taking at the time, and they were an absolute godsend. I mean, they were so fantastic. They became such a lifeline for me, especially because I was in conflict quite a bit with my husband by then, which was a surprise to me because we'd had so many years of a really low conflict relationship. But nevertheless, things were starting to come up. I was changing. I was growing up. I was moving out of a chapter of being pregnant and breastfeeding, which was so demanding of my time and energy. And then now having the kids in school and kind of wanting to blossom into my own person who was maybe on a different kind of career path than I'd been before, maybe wanted to take some new kinds of risks and redefine herself. It wasn't going well in the marriage. And while we tried really hard to work through it, and I did have a few girlfriends there who could kind of help me externally process what was going on, I mostly felt very, very lonely because I was living 8 hours ahead of my Colorado community. And at the time, because of COVID, all of the businesses had to shut down at 7 p.m. And so with the time difference, it really made it so that the only place that I could be if I wanted to be on the phone with my mom or my sister was at my home. Well, we were living in an apartment in the city with almost no extra elbow room. There really was nowhere I could go to have privacy, to have conversations that might have been helpful and, for me to move through all the emotions I was going through. And so I didn't really move through that stuff very, very well. It was a really clunky, really hard process for me. So after a year of that, we all came back, and it felt like a divorce was probably looming. It was still another year and a half after that point before we actually filed the papers. So by the time we filed, both of us were completely exhausted. We had done everything we could to reconcile the marriage, to try to come back together. We had spent 1,000 hours talking about it. We had gone to counseling appointments. I really do believe that we did everything that we could. But in the end, it couldn't come together. And I had moved out of the house. And so here I am. I'm 32 years old at this point. I have 2 very young children. I'm moving into a house that I owned and was in the middle of renovating. So I'm renovating this house, project managing that, designing it, doing some of the work myself, and also managing my own emotions. I think I spent probably the better part of the first 3 months after the divorce with my face in the carpet crying, honestly. There was a ton of grief that came up. And if anyone's ever lost a primary partner, but especially to lose a partner and to lose the family structure, then you would know how pervasive the grief is. It's in everything. Everything. Just, the same with losing a family member, losing a friendship, a close friendship, or losing a friend to death. It's hard to imagine until you're going through it how closely it impacts all of the different aspects of life. I really, during that time, lost my core identity, because up until then, I'd been identifying as a mother, and that took up the majority of my time and effort. And I'd been identifying as a wife, and I had been identifying as a realtor, which was my job for 14 years at a business that I grew myself, but which I shared with my ex. And it was really tough to continue selling in the way that I had been, because every time I reached out to friends or wanted to go to a party, I had to reiterate what had happened in my marriage. And my lovely friends who have all the care in the world for me, of course, wanted to know what had happened and what went wrong. And nobody had seen that coming. And telling the story again and again was really, really tough. So I stopped selling so much. I started to spend most of my time home alone. I spent some of my time with girlfriends who, maybe 5 or 6 of my closest girlfriends. That was really helpful at the time. I didn't date much in the early days. I started to date a little bit as the year after my divorce progressed, but those first several months, I just was an absolute puddle of a person. And this identity shaking experience forced me into a state where I had to become very curious about myself. And I was in a place where surrendering spiritually felt like the only natural next step. So as part of the surrendering process, I would ask the question, who am I meant to be? Like, if I was going through this divorce and it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me in my adult life, and I was so heartbroken and so busted up over it, then I really felt that there had to be a purpose behind it. I really felt that this incredible loss had to come with a new definition of myself, and with the definition of a self that would be more impactful, that would be living a bigger life, that would be living a life that wouldn't have been possible inside my marriage. And so I began to ask that question during my meditations, during prayer. Who am I meant to be? Who am I meant to be? And the emergence of this new idea of who I could become started to sort of trickle in various little ideas and little inspirations. It was very much a creative process to reiterate myself. And I had some really magical experiences along the way. I mean, I don't know how else to describe them. There's synchronicity, there was just a dose of pure, inspired delight. Now I'll tell you the story. So I remember having asked this question, who am I and who am I meant to be? And as I asked the question, one of the things that began to happen is that I began to be inspired to write. So I was writing. Sometimes many hours a day. I just sat down and just like stream of consciousness didn't even go through the filter of my mind. It just flowed out of me. And I wrote what ended up being the first draft of a book that I'm still working on. In the process of writing the book, I began to feel like, if I'm going to publish a book someday, I would like to choose my own name, because I don't really want to go out into the world as my most creative, self-invented person with my ex-husband's last name in tow. And I do still have his last name as my legal name for the sake of convenience and because it's my children's last name. So I'm not planning on changing my legal name, but I really wanted something that felt more like me, like an expression of who I am now as this person who is emerging in her spirituality, emerging emotionally as a healed woman. Because at that point I was beginning to feel like I was actually actively healing. And so I started to sort of scan for name ideas. I just sort of, it was something that ran in the background for me, where I was just kind of always thinking like, what would it be? What would that name be? What would a pen name be? And one day I'm driving down the highway and my favorite Danish rock band comes on, and it was a song that I had never heard before. And I was so absolutely in love with this song. And I look at the name of it and it's for Evigt. And I was like, oh my God, Evigt, what is that word? It's so good. It's so juicy. Like, oh, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I think that there are the things that inspire us. They could be the most random little things. All of us have been inspired by something that's like universally awe-inspiring. Like you go to the Grand Canyon and you're like, oh my God, this is incredible. Or you go to see some of the architecture in Europe makes me feel that way. There's just like, and other people do too. You walk down the street with someone and they're like, oh my God, look at the cathedral. It's beautiful. But it can also happen in unexpected ways where we feel inspired by things that hit us really hard, but might not ever hit someone else. And so that's what happened for me, where I felt extraordinarily inspired by the name or the word Evigt. And I felt so inspired by it, but that the next time I pulled over, I actually looked it up on Google Translate, because this is a Danish song and I didn't know exactly what they were talking about. My heritage is Danish, though, my personal heritage. And so I look it up and it means eternally. I was like, this is so perfect. I love this. And so I started to think of it as a name, and it wasn't fully fleshed out at that point because I hadn't come up with a first name yet, but I knew that I wanted this to be like my last name. And it was probably, I don't know, it was probably a few weeks later that I had an experience one day where I was planning on doing some work, and I was going to go work at my favorite coffee shop in up in the mountains a little bit. But something was kind of gnawing at me to go down the mountain into the city instead and work at the Barnes & Noble coffee shop down there. This is completely off pace for me because I can't really say that I feel inspired at the Barnes & Noble coffee shop. I love perusing the books. Like I love books in general. So being with the books is great. But out of working at a cute little cafe in the mountains where there's like it's like this old wood, and the cafe is like built into the mountain. It's super cool. And that's usually where I go to work when I leave the house. Versus working in this kind of commercial, sterile space. I couldn't understand why I felt compelled to go to Barnes & Noble, but I did. And I'm sitting there and I'm working, and this man comes and stands in line for a coffee. And I recognized him immediately. He's hard to miss. He's like covered head to toe in tattoos. He is missing one leg from the knee down, and he's got this service dog who he brings around with him, who's just like the sweetest dog you've ever met in your life. And I go up to him and I'm like, "Hey, I recognize you from my spiritual center a couple weeks ago." And he goes, yeah, that was me. He goes, "Hi, my name is Infinity." And I was like, "Oh, it's so good to meet you." And I end up chatting with him, and we talked for I think 2 hours that day. He tells me his whole life story, which is completely, the entire story was like one unexpected turn after another, just such a rich, juicy spiritual journey that this man has been on. And then at the end of the story, he starts telling me about what he does now, and he makes this beautiful jewelry, and he sells it, and that's how he gets by. And so I look through his jewelry, and I pick out a piece, and I was like, "I want this one for my niece." And I go to pay him on one of the payment apps, and I see his legal name there. And I was like, "Hey, by the way, what's the deal with your name, Infinity? Like, what is that? Where did that come from?" And he tells me the story of how he got his name. And he goes, "Well, I believe that we're all infinite. That's what we are." And I was like, "Oh my God, Infinity, I have to tell you. I just had a really similar experience, this inspiration that came to me about this word Evigt." And he goes, "Well, yeah, that's your new name." So I was like, okay. It was so validating. It just felt so good to hear this from him and to have this shared experience. So then I think that was on a Thursday, and it was like Sundays of that week. So like 3 days later, I go to my spiritual center, and we're sitting down, and the spiritual leader has the ushers passing out these little white tiles. And she says, "Okay, today we're going to talk about the phenomenon of spiritual renaming in the Bible. And I want all of you," at the end of her talk, after she had gone through all of these different examples, she goes, "I want you now to write down your new name on this tile." 3 days later. So, of course, I write down Evigt, and I'm like, this is it. Like, if this isn't a sign from the heavens, I don't know what is. So from that point on, I adopted the name as my creative name, not my legal name. But then the rest of the evolution of who I could be as Evigt began to unfold just little by little. So first I started thinking about, okay, what was a good first name? And I landed on my middle name, which is Lea. And I thought, Lea Evigt, that feels like collaboration to me. That feels like me and the divine hanging out and coming up with this idea together, brainstorming this thing together, which is what I really want my life to be, myself to be. And then I start thinking, all right, what's the biggest, boldest version of Lea Evigt? Who is she? What is she doing in the world? What's important to her? What are her values? I meditate with all of this. And over the course of a year, different iterations came up. But the one that kept sticking, the thing that I kept circling back to, was this vision that I had of myself with pink hair and black clothes. And it just felt so fun. And I would say that was the defining emotional response. It was like, this is so joyful. This feels so creative. This just feels fun. And I think that that was really the driver for me in choosing how I present myself. I didn't come at this from the perspective of like, hey, I'd like to start a life coaching brand, and what would people like? What do they need? What would seem really, I don't know, like I didn't go at it through the filter of what would other people think of me or my brand if I look this way, dress this way, talk this way. I really came at it through the experience of myself and then wanted to bring that out into the world. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of where I came from. Where I'm going, I don't exactly know. I have big visions for what this podcast could be. I'd love to be on stage speaking someday. I want to finish my book and publish that. I'm going to keep going with the coaching, absolutely, because I love those sessions so much. And a big part of what I coach now, especially after having this personal experience, is creative process, because creative process, I think, creativity is kind of the most human thing that we can do. We are, if we are, according to my Christian upbringing, I was always told we're made in the shape of the Creator, which means we are meant to create. I mean, that's how I interpret that. And I think that's sort of our highest calling. It's like, what can we create? Now, you can create art in a conventional way, drawing, painting, music, theater. I think that's what we usually think of when we think about creativity. But when I think about creativity these days, I think about creating a life. I think about creating an identity that feels 100% authentic, 100% joyful and loving and free. And that to me feels almost like the highest creative pursuit that I could personally go for these days. Like, I grew up, like I said, I got an art minor in school, and so I grew up as an artist. I loved art from day one. And I've made art with every medium you can imagine. I've been a potter, and I've done a lot of textile art, and of course drawing and painting, photography, jewelry making, book making, like name a medium except for graphic design. Dear God, help me. Somebody send me a graphic designer. I have done graphic design. It's just that it's my least favorite. But I've done all these different kinds of art. And for me right now, interior design. Oh, that's a good one too. But for me right now, the juiciest type of art that I could make is a life that I absolutely love to live. And this experience has been not just transformative, but has been so meaningful to me, has brought so much freedom to my life, that it's inspired me to want to share it with whoever is interested, right? If you're not interested, if you're not curious about making a life for yourself, if you're happy with the life that you're living, that's great. That's awesome. But I know that's not the case for a lot of people. I know that right now we have the highest rates of depression, suicide, anxiety, mental health issues across the board, a real struggle to find meaning, a real struggle to find purpose and direction. So this creative work can help us to step out of that. So today, I put together a 4-step creative process that you can employ to redefine, restructure, recreate some part of your life. This comes loosely from Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, which I highly recommend, and also with some input of my own. So the first thing you need to do is ask a question. You heard my question. My question was, who am I now that I'm emerging from this experience of loss and pain? And once I determine who I am, what is the biggest version of that self that I could possibly be? So those were my questions. But you need to find your own questions, because for each person, it could be very similar to that, but it could be very different. There may be some other aspect of your life that you'd like to redefine. It could be your primary relationship that needs restructuring to kind of recycle the old stuff that's there and build it into something new. It could be a career path that you want to make change. It could be your parenting style that you would like to completely restructure and turn it into a work of art, right? Have you ever thought about parenting as a work of art? What does that mean? What does that look like? There's all these different parts of our lives, and each one of them could use this creative process. So you'll find your own question, and I have a suggestion. This is step 1 for how to do that. Write 1 page a day. Just sit down every single morning and do a sort of stream of consciousness journal entry. And then, and this is the important part, go back through that page and circle 1 sentence on the page that made you feel a little bit stuck. Circle the sentence that made you cringe, because this is where your mental or emotional block lives. This sentence that you didn't really want to finish, that felt uncomfortable even to write to yourself, even you know that no one's ever going to read it, that sentence is the key to finding your question. Because once you find that question of where do I feel stuck? Where does life feel a little bit like tense? Where is there friction? You can start to ask how to move out of that, coming out of it as a new version of yourself maybe, or a new version of some part of your life. The second step in the creative process, or a second step, there's a million different ways to be creative, everyone, just in case that's not clear. These are just 4 ways that are really fun, that are really reliable, something you can write down and come back to time and time again, but we'll go over more as the podcast continues. Second step for today is to name your inner critic. My inner critic, which is also my ego, has a name, and her name is Edwina. So let's see, how many names is that now? I have my legal name, I've got my alter ego name, Lea Evigt, and then I've got Edwina, my very honestly kind of intolerable egoic voice. The reason it's so helpful to name this voice in your head is because that inner critic is going to have a voice no matter what. Even as you move forward in the work, the voice over time, as you do years and years of inner work, that voice can become quieter and quieter and less often, but it'll still come up. And when it does, it's nice to characterize it, to say, hey, that's Edwina. Because if you don't give it a name and give it its own character, you're going to subscribe to the idea that it is part of your essential self, which is not true. Your essential self is, in effect, your soul, the part of you that's pure and good and wants to experience all of the juicy loveliness of living a human life. That's your essence. Your ego is going to say, that doesn't sound like a good idea. I don't think you should live your most expansive life. That sounds scary. There's a lot of social reasons that you shouldn't go in that direction. There's a lot of financial reasons this isn't going to work. There's a lot of logistical reasons that this is scary. Whatever it is, the inner critic can be very prominent. But when we depersonalize it a little bit and we say, oh, well, that's just, Edwina is being Edwina again, it's easier to separate ourselves from it. And then to practice some kind internal self-talk. So that just sounds like, hey, Edwina, I totally understand that, you think it's silly to put out a podcast and there's only going to be 10 people listening and, you're thinking it's probably going to be a waste of time, but I'm going to tell you what. It's not going to be our greatest work. It's not going to be the greatest creative effort we've ever made, especially in the beginning, right? Like it's going to be kind of, it'll be what it is. We're going to do B-level work, but it's going to be okay because we're going to stick with it and we're going to get better and we're going to grow a following, whatever that following looks like. And if we keep doing the work, something cool is going to happen. So I'm hearing everything you're saying. I totally understand where you're coming from. You want the best for us, but you can just hang out for a minute, chill, let me know if there's a real crisis, okay? And then in kind of having that dialogue over time, you'll find that that voice really does feel somewhat pacified, feels heard, feels acknowledged, and can sort of let up. So that is number 2. Number 3 is to do a media fast 1 day a week. That means no scrolling, no phones at all. If you can stay off even phone calls, that's ideal. No TV, no media whatsoever, no media inputs. And the idea here is that the noise from our media consumption is overpowering the very faint, subtle idea that wants to be born from within us. So we're receiving all of these outputs, and the outputs are very noisy and they are constant. The creative process isn't about taking from outside of ourselves, right, and mashing it together. Okay, that's a brainstorming session with people in a marketing room or something, oh, this is what's trending right now, and this is what people like, and this is how we're going to pander to this group of people. Okay, fine, do that elsewhere. The creative process is about bringing to life something that is inside of you and only you and wants to come alive. And so taking that day every single week and being away from our phones, being away from our computers is essential, because it gives us the silent time that we need to come back to our essential self. Step 4, ship out B-grade work. For the perfectionists out there, this is going to be really hard to do, but I promise it's actually a great exercise that's going to perpetuate and give traction to your work much, much faster. This is going to be one of the best things you can do to expedite your creative process. One of the biggest hindrances that we oftentimes run into is perfectionism, and how am I going to, if I'm going to put something out in the world, it's the absolute best that it can be. I even remember an art teacher saying that to me one time. He said, I don't put my name on anything and put it up on the wall unless I think it's the absolute best version that it can possibly be. And you can certainly work that way. The problem with it is that part of the process of creating art is the presentation itself. Yes, you're going to work on your technical skills behind the scenes. Yes, you're going to work on color theory. Yes, you're going to work on composition. You're going to work, if you're working in a different creative pursuit, maybe it's acting, you're going to work on your stage presence. You're going to do all of that behind the scenes. But it doesn't mean anything. It isn't real art until it's observed. And the thing that gives it the most meaning is to be observed by someone other than the artist, because art at its core is communication. And communication doesn't happen between one person, right? So we have to put work out in order to complete the process of the art itself. And if we say to ourselves, I'm only going to put work out that is 100% perfect, that I think is the greatest version of what I'm able to make, we're going to severely limit the amount of work that we're willing to create. And eventually what we'll find is that we're just in a very stifled place. But putting out B grade work, okay, could I give this a B? Is it good enough to just get by? If yes, get it out there. And then move on to the next thing and allow the process of iteration and presentation to build more emotional resilience for you. As people start to like or not like your art, you will care less and less. In theory, it is still hard when people come to you and they say oh, that's shit. Okay, well, then go make your own art, And over time, though, we build a sort of confidence in our ability to create and recreate these pieces. whatever they are, and putting them out into the world at B-level work gives us the fuel to keep going. All right, I'm going to stop there for now. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, review, and maybe share this with a friend who would be willing to be your accountability buddy for a weekly commitment to a media fast. And also share your divine self with the world. I love you so much. Mwah.